Well, good morning, BridgeWay. It's great to see you here today. My name is Pastor Ron. I want to add my words of welcome. And if you're new or if you're visiting with us this morning, you're actually coming kind of to the end of a conversation we've been in called Multiply. For the last 6 weeks, we've been looking at how God does math, how God multiplies what we need most, and then gives us this mandate to go out into all the world and to make disciples, to make little followers of Jesus. And of course, this series has also been a part of our building renovation, our capital campaign known as For Our Future. Many of you had an opportunity, a couple weeks ago to go into phase 2 and get to see what God is envisioning for us to do there with expanding our worship area, as well as renovating our children's ministry, youth ministry. This room gets turned into multi-purpose space, a kitchen, offices, outdoor pavilion. All of those things are what we've been dreaming and just leaning into God for the wisdom on to really just, again, reach more people with the message of Jesus. This entire project, as you've heard us mention several times, is a price tag of $6.2 million. And today is Pledge Sunday. Many of you received in the mail over the last couple weeks a pledge card. It looks like this, along with a letter explaining how this project works. And if you received that, if you're ready to make your pledge, today is the day. And we've got boxes both in the square as well as at the Welcome Center. If for some reason you didn't get one of these in the mail, we have more of them at both locations, as well as we just begin this process from the fundraising effort. I want to just preemptively say thank you. In fact, as your pastor, I treasure every single gift over the last 25 years that I've been a part of this church. To see God use it to multiply and to reach people is honestly, it's quite humbling to see the ways in which God uses the resources that we steward here at BridgeWay to reach more people. And that's the goal. So just as your pastor, a sincere thank you to all of you who just provide for the ministry and provide really for the future reach of this ministry, to see people come to know Jesus and to spend eternity in heaven. Our resources, in many ways, provide that opportunity. And today what I want to talk about is I want to talk about money. Now, before some of you get nervous and head for the doors, I really want you to know that this is not by any way a shakedown. In fact, I just want to talk about what Jesus has to say about how we can steward this part of our life, our financial portion of our life. And the way I want to do this is maybe a little bit differently than, maybe you've heard from the church in the past. And what I want to talk about with money is I actually want to talk about the stories that money can tell. In fact, I want to tell you, 3 stories this morning. I want to tell you a story. And then I want us to look together at a story that Jesus tells about money. And then finally is really, the participation part of the message is to challenge you to leave here today and to tell the best story you can with the money and the time and the treasures and the talent that God has entrusted to you. So, 3 stories this morning. The first story is going to come from me. Let me tell you a story and introduce you to this guy, Henry Baxter Childs. If the word Childs sounds familiar to you, it's because this church is located on Childsdale. And Henry Baxter Childs is largely the one responsible for creating what really became kind of an entire town center down in this area. In fact, he bought what was Rockford Paper Company, and he bought this building as it was a sawmill originally. It was a sawmill, it burned down, and he bought it back and decided to become, very innovative. He was going to be the first in the area to make paper. And Henry Baxter Childs, to me, is an incredible businessman, but had some very unusual ideas about how to start a business. In fact, he fired everyone that worked for the sawmill and then hired you back if you were willing to work under his economic system. And by that, I mean he would not pay you in cash, but he would pay you in vouchers. So if you were a worker working in his facility, you would work, I don't know, this is the old paper mill, 50, 60 hours a week. And in exchange for that work, you wouldn't receive cash, you would receive a voucher. They called them scripts. And Henry had all these relationships set up with local farmers, local businesses, grocery stores. He had things set up with the shoe manufacturer. Many of you know Rockford was started sort of on the backs of two industries. One was shoemaking through Hush Puppies. Wolverine Worldwide kind of put Rockford on the map. And he had this system that you could take your vouchers down to Hush Puppies and exchange them for a brand new pair of shoes. If you saved up enough of these vouchers, you could actually rent one of Mr. Child's townhouses. Now, I know this picture is incredibly grainy, but just kind of notice the size of these homes. I've been told that the larger homes were sort of like multifamily housing, but just kind of take note of these houses. You could rent one of these from Mr. Child's. And this area, the word Childsdale, the word dale, actually means valley. So Mr. Childs and his family would sit up on the hill, and they would look down into this valley, and they would see people, I guess I would say, surviving under his economic system. They were working, they were getting by, and there was life happening down in this area of the river. Things kind of got a little bit more interesting as this company, this paper mill, went through what you would call kind of the standard boom and bust environment of manufacturing. The building burned down, the paper mill burned completely to the ground in 1868. It burned down again in 1898, each time the Childs family investing heavily in rebuilding it to kind of keep their economy going. I think it got really interesting when his son, Horace Childs, took over. And by taking over, I mean he began to take quite a bit of the wealth out of the business. In fact, he built a mansion up on House Street. It wasn't called House Street. It was just the street that had the big house on it. I've kind of made my way up there. It's sort of behind Third Nature. I've looked a number of times for the foundation. I've been told it's up there. I haven't found it yet. But you can tell this is a slightly larger home than the townhouses the people were given access to. This was a 24-room home. It was Victorian style. It had stables and horses. The barns had such ornate woodwork that actually, when it came time to liquidate, they sold the barns, and the Pantline Hotel, Amway Hotel, bought them for their use. But things got really spicy when Horace's wife, Frances, suspected Horace of having an affair. He was having an affair, got really interesting in Rockford, with Maud Maynard. She was the postmaster's wife. And one night, late one evening, Frances sat in this very dark home waiting for Horace to come home. He came through the door, and she asked him, confronted him about this affair, and he could not deny it. So she took out a rifle and took a shot at him. And fortunately for him, she missed. But this sort of began the downward spiral for the Childs family, and the family drama just kind of led to more economic woes as the 1920s and the Great Depression just continued to kind of take its toll on manufacturing here in this place. One of my favorite pictures, though, is actually a picture from just up the street. This is the railroad system, which you now run, bike, and walk on, called the White Pine Trail. And this picture is actually of where the White Pine Trail crosses over what is now Childsdale. This spur coming off the railroad came right down the road to our building. And it would drop off coal. In fact, when we did all of our environmental work here, we found lots of residual coal on the property. And then it would get loaded back up with various products. And unfortunately, this paper mill never made a lot of money, although they tried. They innovated with things like making egg crates. They made bags for Purina dog food for a while. They made butcher paper, which they shipped off to Chicago. And at the very end, before they closed their doors, they made cardstock, which would normally get rolled into like toilet paper rolls. That was kind of all they had left that they could make. And for year after year, this place lost money and closed for good as a paper mill in 2001. And BridgeWay, of course, we became a part of this story at the end of 2009. I tell you this story because the story is a story of greed. It's a story of infidelity. It's a story of fortune and failure. And it's a story, honestly, of foolishness. But I think most importantly in the story is it's entirely absent of God. Until BridgeWay began to tell a better story here. And that story is, of course, a story that we're still telling. It's a story of Jesus and how Jesus, when he comes into your life, can change absolutely everything about you, including your relationship with money and possessions and power. And that's the story I want to look at next. I want to look at the story that Jesus tells about how we are to live with all of our possessions so that we can tell a better story with our life. In fact, Jesus told lots of stories about money. We're going to look at just one of them this morning. And if you got a Bible, I would invite you to turn to Luke chapter 12 and just read a short story with me. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, Luke is in the New Testament. Luke is one of what we call the Gospels, the stories of Jesus. Kind of fascinating, Luke was not one of the original disciples of Jesus. He came on the scene after the resurrection of Jesus. But he's a doctor, the good Dr. Luke, and very concerned about getting his facts straight. So Luke kind of went from being a doctor to being sort of an investigative reporter. And he started interviewing firsthand accounts of people that were around when Jesus taught the words that we're reading this morning. In fact, Luke actually worked very closely with the writings of both Matthew and Mark. He borrowed from Matthew, Matthew borrowed from Mark, and that's why we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic gospels. They're sort of in sync with one another. And at this point in the teaching of Jesus, he's attracting quite a crowd. You could say that Jesus and his teachings were incredibly famous. Literally, the text says that there were thousands of people gathering to hear what Jesus had to say. Now, he's already addressed the topic of money. He's talked about caring for people. He's told the story of the Good Samaritan. And just before what we're about to read, Jesus tells a very chilling, very difficult story to understand about hell. In fact, he talks about how you shouldn't fear the person who can kill your body. Be fearful of the person who can destroy your body and send your soul to hell. Now, I don't know about you, but if that's the teaching that Jesus gave on a Sunday morning, I would have lots of questions for Jesus. But instead, I want you to see the questions that come up because they're questions that all have to do with money. Now, again, Jesus talked a lot about money. About 25% of his teachings were all on this topic. And so watch how he kind of gives this impromptu lesson on money. Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of your possessions." Now again, I just find this humorous. This whole teaching before this is all about hell. Like, don't want you to go there, kind of be fearful of that place. And this guy, first question out of his mouth is like, yeah, hell, that's a great topic, but tell my brother to give me my half of the inheritance, right? I don't know if you've ever experienced this in your family, but a family squabble over money can be very difficult. And this man is sort of like, hey, we've got a problem. Dave Ramsey this problem for me, Jesus. Tell my brother to give me what's coming to me. And I think this is important because before we can even talk about and look at what Jesus has to say about money and possessions and power, we have to really look at what we're capable of as people. And I spent a lot of time before I was a pastor in the financial world. I help people save for and generate wealth for retirement and college savings and all those things. And I tell you, I have seen so many good families, when a loved one passed away, turn into vampires when it comes to money. When they just have this contentiousness and this adversarial approach to money because they want what's theirs. And Jesus knows this and sort of on the prompt has to be ready to give this teaching because he knows what we're capable of. I should say, Jesus knows what our hearts are capable of. And so before we look at the story, let's just address the most obvious, which is that money is always an issue of the heart. How we spend our money, how we invest our money, how we save, in this case, how we even inherit our money. When it comes to giving and tithing and sacrificial living, all of these things are an issue of the heart. And Jesus knows this about us. In fact, he would say in other places, like in the Sermon on the Mount, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And this whole idea of heart is a really important thing to understand. He's not referring to the heart as just a physical blood-pumping organ. In the ancient world, your heart was sort of the place in which all of your spiritual life flowed from. This river of life would flow from your heart. And so Jesus would say, watch out, be on guard against all sorts of greed, because that's what can build up in your heart. Many of you know I love the work of Dallas Willard. In fact, he's my favorite theologian, and he wrote a book called Renovation of the Heart that I'm kind of just reading back through just in my quiet time. And Dallas has this great quote. He says that the greatest need you and I have, the greatest need of collective humanity, is a renovation of our heart. That spiritual place within us from which outlook, choices, and actions has been formed by a world away from God, and now it must be transformed. See, every single person comes to this topic with the same need. We all need this transformation of our heart, the way in which greed can become a part of it. We need that to be transformed. So now with that as the backdrop, Jesus is going to give a story, and he's going to tell a story about how a man can renovate their heart towards God. So he picks up this teaching, picking back up in verse 16. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, self, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then Jesus comes out of the story, and he says this to the crowd, thousands of people. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. This is the parable, in my Bible it says, the parable of the rich fool. And it's really the parable of the rich man who becomes very foolish. You read the story, and I don't know, maybe you have some questions. Maybe you're thinking about life and your accumulation of wealth. Maybe you're thinking about your retirement plans, or maybe you're a business owner and you're thinking, like, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of my life in light of Jesus' teachings? And you read this story and you see that for this man, his business flourished immensely. But you have to kind of look at the words that Jesus used in the story. He says that this man has a great harvest. The ground produces a bumper crop. And I don't know what that would look like in your world. I came from a business background, and I don't know, maybe that looked like, hey, this quarter I get a big bonus, right? Or sales are up, gross profit is up, everything is up and to the right? Like everything is going well. And so maybe the first question that you have to kind of address in this story is that a sin? Is it a sin for this man to have a successful business that has a really great year? And I'll give you the answer. The answer is absolutely not. It's not a sin to be rich. Jesus makes it very clear. It's a sin to be a fool. And this man is foolish because he never once thinks about God in the story. In fact, the way Jesus tells it is just so artful. He crafts it in this way in which the man becomes sort of the butt of his own joke. He makes it all about himself. In fact, in my Bible, I just underlined all of the personal pronouns that this man uses in the story. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Over and over, like 10 times in the text, this guy refers to himself. Me, I. It's all about him. He never once even gave a thought to how God factored into the equation of his life. In fact, the story is told that the ground produced a crop. This man never once thought about, hey, the ground is God's, and I'm just here to work it and steward it. And hey, by the way, crops don't just produce themselves in the ground. You need like the right conditions. You need water to feed and nourish those plants. And so it was God that made it rain on those plants. He never once thought of that. He didn't ever think about, hey, it was God that gave this farmer the strength and the know-how and the energy to farm. Never once did he think to thank God for what he had done. Not once, nope. Instead, it's, I'll build bigger barns. And I think this is the part in the story where we just need to be personally reflective. And we need to look at the story and we need to ask, hey, in some ways, do I do the same thing? Do I reflect kind of the same atmosphere of me, I need to build bigger barns? I was doing a little research this week and just kind of came across this statistic on storage units. And I couldn't find the number of actual storage units, but I found that there were 52,000 companies that will rent you a storage unit. And it just kind of stuck with me. 52,000 companies renting storage space. And I don't know if you remember the show Storage Wars. I love that show. You know, one man's junk is another man's treasure. And every now and then there'll be a treasure, but most of the time, right, it's just junk. And it's old toasters, and it's wicker furniture, and it's record players, things that just probably have no real use in this world. And I started thinking about that, and I know our team with Bridge of Hope is going down to Guatemala, and I started thinking about, you know, some of the homes we've built in Guatemala. They're about this size. In fact, the widows and orphans in Guatemala would love a cement floor and a tin roof over their head, and we store our extra stuff in them. You know, it's sort of amazing to think about how we amass, and how I personally I can amass stuff and possessions and wealth. And I can fall in the same trap, too, of not thinking, what can I do to thank God with it? And so maybe the point here in this story is really not about more money, but instead to not ask God for more money, but to ask God for more wisdom. Instead of more money, ask God more wisdom, because we need wisdom. Next slide. We need wisdom with how we'll deal with and handle our money. In fact, I worked in the financial industry for a number of years before becoming a pastor, and I could tell you, I saw people, and I loved helping people. I loved helping them save for retirement and reach for their goals. But I did it back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and there was a funny thing going on in the stock market, and it was this unprecedented rise in stocks. I mean, stocks were going up 3, 4, 500%. And I would be this financial advisor that was trying to tell people, my clients, when I'd call them on the phone, like, hey, you know, this is unprecedented, don't expect this, 7%, 8%, that's a good number. And I would get fired as the financial advisor because they were getting, triple-digit returns. It was just insane. And then, of course, the dot-bomb era where stocks plummeted and people saw the value of just wise investing. I saw a lot of greed during that time. Greed for the sake of more returns, more money. I got to a point at that point where it became very discouraging to try to help people when it was so unrealistic and outside of even the realism of that this all comes from God. When it comes to money, there's only 3 things we can do with it. We can save it, we can spend it, or we can give it. We can tithe, we can use it to build the kingdom. And giving truly is living, because as this man learned, you cannot take it with you. I think about this man too. He was building barns for grain, right? Nothing eternal, nothing that will last. Grain, things that could blow away in the wind, a barn that could get destroyed in a tornado. It wasn't people, it wasn't life, it wasn't anything that would last forever. And God said to this man, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And again, Jesus comes out of this story and he reminds every person listening to the story, this is how it will be for whoever stores up for themselves, but is not rich towards God. I want to just say one last thing, because I've been preaching for a long time, and I've listened to a lot of preachers talk about money, and I've always carried just a really careful sensitivity to this topic, because there are really 2 major abuses when it comes to preaching what the Bible has to say about money. And I want to give them to you this morning just so that I too don't ever fall into this trap. One of the errors in talking about money from the pulpit is to make it what we call a prosperity gospel. That if you give all your money to God, you too will prosper. These are late night TV evangelists that will say these sort of things. And it's just not true. There's no guarantees. There's nothing. We give out of the wisdom that God has already blessed us with everything. So prosperity gospel, terrible way to live. Not what I would recommend. But at the same time, I want to guard against the other false teaching, which is the poverty gospel, which says, well, everyone should be poor. Jesus was poor. Everyone else should be poor. And that's just not biblical either. It's about wisdom. It's about asking God to show us, how do I be wise with all that you've given me, my time, my talents, and the treasures that I'm called to steward. I've told this story several times, but years and years ago when Sean and I kind of left the financial world and we came into the church world, we had to make a lot of adjustments, a lot of changes in our finances and our personal life, and we just decided then that we were going to honor God with what he's blessed us with. And I remember us making this decision that we would just take our checks. Do you remember checks? You used to write these things out, right? Hardly ever write a check now, so I don't think this illustration works as well. But we had printed on our check Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And every time we wrote a check, I'd glance up at that little verse, and I'd be reminded, hey, I'm the steward. I'm not the owner. I don't get to own this land. I don't own what's in this bank account. I get to steward it. I don't know. I was thinking this week, maybe you need to put Psalm 24, verse 1 on a screensaver so that every time you go on Venmo, right, you're reminded, the earth is the Lord's, or you go on your online banking, but it's a reminder that it's all God's. And I want to be rich towards God. I've told you 2 stories this morning, and I want to challenge you with the final story to just simply ask, what story will you tell? We all have the opportunity with our money, with our possessions, with our credit cards, with our debit cards, even with our Venmo, to make a decision. How will you love God and use money to reach more people for the kingdom of God? We want to do it that way. We want to love God and we want to use money, not the other way around. We don't want to use God and just love our money in this life, as the story tells us. And that's our goal, that this church would be a church transformed, renovated at our heart's level so that God would reach more people and that we would use these resources kind of with the open hand, just kind of a lightness to how we use them to see more people come to know Jesus as their Lord and Savior. I want to pray for you. I want to invite the team to come up and to lead us just in a time of reflection this morning. And so if you would bow your heads and pray with me, please. God, I want to thank you this morning that you care about the practical stuff of life. You care about the stuff that we all have to deal with. We all have to deal with our money. And you want us to be wise. So God, I just pray that over us as a community, that we would be wise with all that you've entrusted us with. That we would steer clear of foolishness, and that we would be rich towards you in the kingdom. God, I just pray that you would help us. I realize I'm just touching on this subject, and there are some here today that really need your wisdom in the matters of their money. And so God, I pray that you would just work, and you would use these words to dwell deep in our souls for how we treat you and everyone with all that you've given us, Lord. May we build your kingdom here. It's in your name we pray. Amen.